Thank you very much indeed, Barry. Barry and I have fought battles right the way back to Maastricht. All those years ago, I just retired from Parliament after 40 years. I fought the battles because I believed in them. I believed that we had to regain our right to govern ourselves. And as I said earlier, I would also like to pay tribute to my Conservative Association in Stafford and in Stone for supporting me right the way through, despite the most amazing pressures that were brought to bear to try to deselect me in 1995-96. It was unbelievable, but my association stood by me 100%, as they did over Maastricht. Years with a sense of humility, because no man is an island. You can be a catalyst as a member of Parliament, but you can't actually win unless you can manage to persuade your association to stay with you. And that was the key issue for me. The rest on the floor of the House of Commons speaks for itself. The last general election, ladies and gentlemen, you all know, was one of the worst, if not the worst, in modern history. But I do want to say this because it's really important. The idea that it's all over and done with is not true. We have only got 121 seats, but you know something? It was very similar in 1945. In 1945, when actually my predecessor, Hugh Fraser, was returned for Stone in Staffordshire, one of the very few. And he and I spanned the whole of that period from the end of the war right the way to 1984 when I retired. So there are only two MPs in that area. They're very consistent people in Staffordshire, and they did the right thing for the right reason time and time again. But we also had another experience. There have been several, but one of them was also, funnily enough, of equal significance to this issue of immigration, which I'll come on to in a moment. It was over the Corn Laws. I don't know whether people in this room are acquainted with the Corn Laws, but it was a very, very controversial issue. And it was all about whether or not people were going to be able to buy bread at the right price. That's the way of summarising. It was about free trade. It was about actually what I would describe, going back to the title of this talk, Thatcher principles. And Robert Peel, who was one of our greatest prime ministers, during the 1820s had been in favour of the Corn Laws because he knew that all people in the House of Commons got their seats from Conservatives who were also aristocrats who benefited enormously from creating their Downton Abbeys and all the rest of it. But the fact is that there was a problem which arose in the 1840s. There were two problems, actually. There was a chap called Richard Colton, who was a fantastic economist, not very good at business, but he did understand free market economics. And there was a chap called John Bright. And John Bright was a member for Birmingham. I'm closely, directly related from the Bright family, and I wrote a book about him. And the most interesting thing for me is this, that the disaster that occurred to the Conservative Party, both in 1945 and in that period of the 1830s and 40s, has certain similarities. We were written, but you know something, you don't write off the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party has within it people as well as policies and principles, which Margaret Thatcher encapsulated when she took over from Edward Heath in 1975. And I have to say this, that the Bruges Group was founded for Margaret Thatcher. I run a think tank called the European Foundation. that was founded to perpetuate the same principles, which is self-government, free market economics, to have the opportunity to allow the British people to govern themselves. We were founded during the time of the Maastricht Rebellion. The Bruges Group, likewise. The Bruges speech was made in September 1988, and it was made for those reasons, because she talked about the rolling back, as Barry has just said, of the frontiers of the state. We're faced with a similar situation now. It looked like a catastrophic defeat. It was a catastrophic defeat. But the seeds of defeat carry with it the means of recovery. We did it in 1945. We did it, in fact, in the mid-19th century. And funnily enough, just to mention John Bright once more, he actually became a liberal unionist to protect Westminster and to protect Ireland at that time. But he also became a liberal unionist because he believed in the principles not only of free trade, but also proper democratic government. And he was himself responsible for the passing of the Reform Act of 1867, which gave the right to the working man to be able to vote in elections. It may come as a surprise to you, but before that, they didn't have that right. He fought as the Member of Parliament of Birmingham to give the people from the working class, as it was called in those days, the right to vote. And overnight, it was passed by Disraeli, who realised that he was right, just as Peel discovered that Cobden and Bright were right. So changing your position on fundamental questions can lead to great things. And I want to say this about Robert Jenrick, because people say, oh, he's a Remainer. Well, actually, funnily enough, and I say this with great respect to my greatest heroine, Margaret Thatcher, in 1975, that's what she was. She had decided that she was going to back the vote to remain in the European Union at that time. And it's not surprising, because there was so much pressure being brought to people at that time that she made that decision. The Conservative Party is based on values and principles. They go back to the likes of Edmund Burke in the late 18th century, really. There is no discernible basis for the origins of the Conservative Party, but it's pretty impressive. You go back to the 1770s, and Edmund Burke is there, the great philosopher king, if you might say, of the Conservative tradition. And Margaret Thatcher looked back to those times as well. She understood the need for free markets in economics, and she came to understand the need for free democratic government. She was constrained by those around her, like Douglas Hurd, Geoffrey Howe, Michael Heseltine. These are people euphemistically described as big beasts. Well, they were certainly extremely effective in trying to block her. And it took her a bit of time to assess what she was going to do and how to go about it. And the Bruges speech was that moment of truth. It wasn't complete, and it required further action. But she represented the thinking of the Conservative Party, which represented the principles of the Conservative Party in her own time. Now, we are now faced with a similar situation. We have won our ability to govern ourselves. Our laws are now made by our own members of Parliament, in our own Parliament, and not by a council of ministers in Brussels who convene together behind closed doors without even a transcript. No hands up. Nobody knows how they arrive at the decisions. They are either made by majority vote or they're made by consensus. And that consensus is a false consensus, because they know before they go in the room who's going to win. So all those laws that go all the way back to 1973, when we entered, after the passing of the European Community Act 1972, which subjugated this country, the decision of the European Community as it was, and now the European Union, is what is now affecting all the countries of Europe, which is why you may have noticed that there is this resurgence of a call for national identity throughout the whole of Europe. Economically and politically, Europe is gradually, and in many respects more recently, rapidly disintegrating. And it carries with it some real problems, because some of the people who are taking over in some of these countries are not what we would describe as our favourite people. But that is not the issue. The issue is that people want to be able to govern themselves. It's a basic human right. We hear an enormous amount about human rights, but the greatest human right is the right to be able to vote. There is the right to life. There is the right to make your choice about the kind of government you want. And that is what Brexit was always all about. From the 1980s, when I first entered Parliament, I came to that conclusion, and I made it my sole objective, which was to get back sovereignty in this country. And sovereignty sounds like a theoretical, philosophical analysis. It is not. It's actually about democracy. Because you can't have democracy if you don't have your own sovereignty. If you can't pass your own acts of parliament according to the decisions that are taken by the voters in elected parliaments, then that parliament becomes a worthless rubber stamp. And that's what I discovered when I got into parliament in 1984. So when I look at the Thatcherite principles, which we're commemorating today, in the light of the disaster we had in the last general election, but knowing that we managed to achieve Brexit and give back self-government, we have a double fight on our hands. One is a purely party political one. The other is to guarantee the consolidation against the background of a Labour government, which doesn't really believe in Brexit at all, who have 411 seats in Parliament and can pass that legislation, if they wanted, either to rejoin or to reset, as they call it. I don't trust them. I don't trust them. The Sovereign Act of Parliament was passed to enable the referendum to take place, yes or no. And that was passed by a fairly narrow majority, but decisively. And Brexit has been a success, not a failure. I can elaborate on that, and you may like to ask questions. But the basic point is we got back our self-government. And after that, as you might say, it's over to you, by which I mean the government in power. If you've got the power to make the decisions, you don't hand them over to the civil servants. You don't hand them over to foreign countries and foreign courts. You don't allow the European Court of Justice, the European Court of Human Rights, or for that matter, having got rid of the European Court of Justice, to continue with their rulings. You decide on the laws you want, and you have them enforced by your own courts in your own land. And that is what Brexit is all about. So, I now turn to the question of what the virtues would be at this make or break moment, and I mean make or break. If we end up with the wrong leader in this election that's taking place at this party conference, we will be in a very, very bad way. We've got to get it right, because there's so much ground to catch up, not only in terms of the seats that we've got to reclaim, but in holding back the hordes of people who either abstained or voted for reform. I understand what they were saying. They were angry, they were frustrated. Doesn't surprise me. I was. But the reality is that on that particular issue of immigration, We could have got through, in the British Nationality and Borders Bill, the right to get those planes off to Rwanda. We could actually have overridden international law. Now, it gets a bit complicated at this point, because people say, what is international law compared to UK law? Well, I'll tell you something, which you may or may not know, and that is that in many countries, with their written constitutions, including those of Germany, Portugal, and most of the others, in fact, of the European Union, they are bound by a written constitution which gives precedence of international law over domestic law. In other words, whatever the people say in Germany, international law takes precedence. And ECHR, European Court of Human Rights, is part of that international law. They also have the Charter of Fundamental Rights, which we removed by Brexit. So we have the right, not only in this country, the unique unwritten constitution. And there's another thing to throw into the pot, and that is that the Supreme Court will obey any law passed by Parliament in our sovereign Parliament, even if it overrides international law, even if it overrides the European Court of Human Rights, even if it deals emphatically and completely with the problem of illegal migration, for example. Why do I say that? As I had to explain to Rishi Sunak, to no avail, I'm afraid. In the judgment that you've heard of, the Rwanda judgment, it was called, the Lord President of the Supreme Court, which is really what this was all about, allowed an appeal to be dismissed of an Iraqi national on the grounds that by the sovereignty of Parliament, his case had been effectively removed. He didn't have the right to claim what he was claiming. And that meant that the Act of Parliament prevailed, and the Supreme Court backed Parliament against all the human rights people, against all the international lawyers. And they said that this was the case. Now, this is absolutely fundamental, because it is the application of Acts of Parliament in practice. The Supreme Court will, if we get the wording clear and unambiguous, that's the test. If the Act of Parliament to deal with international law, immigration law, and the other matters which involve human rights, if Parliament comes to the conclusion that it wants us to pass an Act of Parliament to rectify the problems we've had over immigration, members of the European Union can't change it because they've got written constitutions. They do make that change. We can do it. And actually, we were able to do it both under the Home Office in the British Nationality and Borders Bill and subsequently in the illegal migration bill. The fact that we didn't do it meant one thing. We lost credibility with the British public. We said we were going to deal with illegal migration. We didn't do it. We couldn't do it. We could have done if we'd used clear and unambiguous words, and that's not what happened. So I hope I've made myself clear. We can override the We do need to renegotiate the European treaties. We do need to reassert the right of Parliament to be making the right decisions, which is why this morning I attended the rally of Robert Jenrick, in which he said, we've left the European Union, Remainers are out. We have to make a decision. We must leave the European Court of Human Rights, and we must have our own Act of Parliament to do it, and it must be clear and unambiguous. If we do that, I would say that a significant proportion, probably half the voters who went to reform, would not have gone to reform if we'd been in that position at the end of June this year. So we have a test. We also have the prospect of a new leader. And Robert Jenrick has set out 10 principles and put us on the right path. And they are, if you hear what I'm about to read them out, I'll be quick, not too long, I just want to get this clear. Margaret Thatcher would have agreed with every single point those 10 principles contain. So number one, the sovereignty of our parliament as a self-governing democratic nation state with the ability to override the European Court of Human Rights. That solves the immigration question. Secondly, growth coming from market economics, on which people such as our great speaker, Tim Corbyn here, knows and understands in a way that goes beyond me. It's above my pay grade, market economics, to explain that he will do it. To reform the National Health Service, in practice, not in theory. To stop mass migration, a cap on migration, legal or illegal, and to reassert our borders irrespective of international law, because we can override it in those circumstances. A small state, he says, that works, not a big state that fails. And he calls for tough and effective justice, cracking down on crime, knife crime, and so forth, and also to have a proper and full defence policy. So he set out these principles. I happen to agree with one of them. I'm certain that I knew Margaret Thatcher really well. I don't talk about it very much, but I can assure you, she stayed with us, I went on holiday with her, we discussed matters over and over again. And she moved from the Bruges speech to a position where they assassinated her, to put it bluntly, because she was right, and they did not want to listen to what she had to say. And in fact, if I was Keir Starmer, Nigel Farage, or Ed Davey, I would not want to be opposed by Robert Jenrick. Listen to that. The one person in the House of Commons who can outflank Starmer by analysis and by an understanding of clear principles and persuade the British people is Robert Jenrick. And Nigel Farage is in the same boat. Neither of them can deal with the degree of analysis and insistence on principle that he brings to bear. So there we are. I understand the frustration, but our economic situation was not, Tim will no doubt explain this, as it should have been. I'm not going to go into the economics of this. What I do know is the Labour Party are on thin ice. They only got 35% of the vote. As we just heard, Reform got 17%. The Liberal Democrats did pretty well, but it's wide open. If we have a leader who goes back to Thatcherite principles and the principles of the Conservative Party on which that was built, it wasn't just Margaret Thatcher, it was 200 years of the developed ideas of how to have a proper democratic state. That is the point. We were brought into a revolution by getting into the European Union, by the seat. We learned it wasn't a good idea. We fought to get out, and the British people, the tribute goes to you, members of the party and to the British people for making the decisions. We were catalysts. We had a voice. We had a voice in our great parliament. We exercised that voice and our political will. Unfortunately, we got the right answer. We must not squander this, and not on people who buy suits paid for by other people. We don't want what I described as the third-rate Burlington versus running this country. But that is an incidental problem. The real problem is a serious one about democracy. It's about self-government. It's about a free parliament. And it's about our consolidating Brexit. But having to do that by making sure that we bring the forces together within this country who are angry and frustrated, whether they voted Conservative or didn't vote Conservative, and whether they voted Reform or not, able to govern our country without fear of having to rejoin the European Union or fear of being dominated by the European Court of Human Rights. Thank you very much.